Good evening, everyone. So today we're going to be looking at the ending of chapter 16, verses 17 onwards. And then we're going to also try and cover the chapter 17. I was trying to think of an example to explain in a very rough sense what's happening here. And one thing that came to mind is back in the olden times. I mean, even now it's becoming popular again. But in order to create a t-shirt, what these makers would do is they have a pattern, and the pattern is the cutout of where the ink is supposed to go through and come onto the shirt. Looking at the pattern by itself, it's hard to understand what the final image is. But once the pattern is pressed onto a shirt and then the ink is pressed through the parts of the pattern where the hole is, and then it's lifted up, you see the image on the shirt. That example itself is good, but then let's complicate it a little bit more. If you have more than one color on a t-shirt, that means you have several patterns that need to be applied with different inks. And at some points, the pattern will overlap so that what you get is a combination of those colors. And other times the pattern will not overlap because that's where you want just a particular color to show up on the shirt. And any one of these parts by itself will give you something that's worth looking at. But it's only when you overlap all of them together do you start to get a very well-defined and articulated image. Here, as we're finishing up the 7 bowls, we're going to be looking again at some stuff that seems to have already happened. And that's okay, because what we're trying to do is get a fuller understanding, a fuller, more vibrant picture of what the end of everything culminates to. So remember back when we were talking last week in Revelation chapter 16, we just ended with the 6th angel pouring the 6th bowl. And this was the culmination of the great battle, the battle at Har Megiddo or Harmageddon, or some people based on the movies will talk about it as the Battle of Armageddon. Or whatever it may be, we expect in the 6th bowl, in the 7th bowl to now see that battle take place, because the battle hasn't actually happened in the 6th bowl. And then you turn to Revelation chapter 16, verse 17 onwards, and the 7th angel shows up with the 7th bowl, and he pours it out, and with a loud voice, he says, "It is done." And then you have verse 18, a listing of all these different signs that happen at this moment. There is an earthquake, there's flashing of lights, there's rumbling, there's thunder, such that we've never seen anything like this before. Notice that this is now the 4th time that John is getting a picture of the day of the Lord's victory over evil. This is the 4th time because we've already seen it at the 7th seal. We've seen it at the 7th trumpet. We've seen it just a few chapters earlier in the end of chapter 14, where the final justice has been dealt out. And again, we're seeing it here with the 7th bowl. And so this is overlapping. But each time we overlap, we're getting a richer image. We're getting a clear understanding of the nuances of how this all comes together. Just so you can meditate on the beauty of this and the mystery of this. Notice how the 7th bowl sounds a little familiar. A voice crying out, "It is done," sounds a lot like a voice crying out, "It is finished." There's a great earthquake that happened at the time of Jesus's crucifixion as well. The great curtain that separated the people from God was torn in two, and here you have a similar echoes of it. Now, of course, this is the fulfillment of all of those things. And you see that the great city is divided. It's split into 3. And what is this great city? It's not Jerusalem. We have to remember how the imageries have been building on top of one another. In Revelation chapter 11, verse 8, we were told that this city, this great city, is is similar in type to Sodom and to Egypt. Whatever it may be, the kingdoms of this world are utterly flattened. They are toppled down, and they drink the full wrath of God's fury. And this is to show that there is no power in this world. There is no superpower. There's no force in this world that can compare to God and his sovereignty when he pours out his final justice. This is kind of a conclusion, but of course there's still more to learn. And so John is asked by this one of the angels who was present and who had poured out one of the bowls. And this angel said, "Hey, do you want to see how all of this happens?" And of course, John is not going to pass up on such an invitation. And so John is taken to see now another sort of thing that's taking place. He sees a woman, and this woman is sitting on a beast. And riding on this beast, the woman is named, or it's basically, this prostitute is Babylon the Great. At least this is what the woman is called in chapter 17, verse 5. The angel says this is a mystery. The mystery of her name doesn't seem like much of a mystery, because he just told us what the name of the woman is. It's Babylon the Great. So this is the thing. The mystery is not so straightforward. This isn't just a particular kingdom that we can trace back in history, but this is the spirit of that kingdom that seems to pop up again and again and again throughout all of history. And so it's not easy to name this woman other than to just call her the Great Babylon, or that kingdom that embodied a community of people that decides to live against God's will. These are a group of people like at the Tower of Babel that came together in their one mission to overthrow God and to no longer need God in their lives. So this is the woman, and the woman is riding on the beast. So who is the beast? Well, so if the woman can represent any one of these nations that are in the same spirit as Babylon, well, then the beast is the same beast that represents the one sent by the dragon that we had read about earlier. It's the same one, because we see the similar number of heads and the horns, and not only that, we're told that the beast is filled with blasphemous names, and that's a clear reference to Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, where this beast first shows up, or at least shows up in the sense that he is commissioned by the dragon to go out into the world. Now, the idea is this: rebellious humanity is riding on top of the power of Satan. And what is it doing? It's drinking the blood of the saints, and not just drinking the blood of the saints, but getting drunk off of it. So this is an excessive amount of violence that this woman or this kingdom is drinking in. So much so that John sees this, and my Bible translation, the NRSV translation, says, "When I saw her, I was greatly amazed." Greatly amazed. That doesn't fully capture what this word can mean. It's a kind of shock. It's a kind of wonder. How can this be? How can it be that such a woman riding on a beast would think to drink the blood and go after the innocent like this? And this would shock any one of us, but it doesn't seem to shock the angel. And the angel in verse 7 said to me, "Oh, why are you so amazed?" And then he goes on to explain something about this dragon and this woman. So the mystery of the woman, according to verse 7, and the beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns that carries it. And it goes like this. And there's this interesting thing where the beast that you saw was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. Now, I am with you. This is confusing. It's not very straightforward. So this is the beast that was, but isn't now, and it's about to be released from the bottomless pit. What could it refer to? Now, later on, we're going to find out that the beast with its seven heads are like, and the seven heads are like the seven mountains. And there was a reference for the kingdom of Rome. But then again, there was another idea that says because Rome still does exist, well, maybe there was an emperor who did exist and now is dead, and the spirit of that same sort of evil emperor is about to come back again. It's going to be released again onto the world. It's very difficult to understand what's happening here. There's one clear indication that this is clearly not the same as the one who was, who is, and is to come. Right? That's clear. This is an anti version of that. It's opposing to that idea. But I think also what we can gather from this is this idea that there seems to be a time when this beast was very powerful, not so much, but is going to be very powerful yet again. So if there is a period of time in which it seems that evil isn't rampant, which I can't imagine a time when there would ever be thought of as true, but perhaps there's a season when an evil emperor is overthrown. The idea is that, well, there's this notion that it's going to come back again. This is the strange mystery of this woman. And moreover, what it means is, John, you shouldn't be so surprised by this because you've seen this already. And moreover, you're likely to see it again in the future. This is happening right in front of us. We've seen the martyrs. We've seen the church being persecuted. We've seen kingdoms rejecting God and pushing back against the followers of Christ. This isn't and shouldn't be something so shocking and so amazing, at least from the perspective of this angel. Now, turning towards the beast, let's try and understand and unpack what's being said about it. Verse 9 goes like this. This calls for wisdom. The seven heads are seven mountains on which the woman is seated, and there are also seven kings, of whom five have fallen, one is living, and the other is not yet to come. And when he comes, he must remain only for a little while. So again, you have this reference of was, isn't now, but will be. And here it's a reference of those who had fallen, but one who is, and then one who's coming. It's an interesting play on all of these categories of time and what's present and what isn't. Let's simplify this a little bit. There are three different ways we can interpret this. One way is to look at the seven mountains as a reference to a very common title for Rome, which is Rome was considered as being founded on seven hills. And this is very common in ancient literature. And anyone in John's time who would have picked this book up in its earliest days, the earliest audience, they would have heard the seven mountain reference and would have clearly thought, this is referring to Rome. And if it's referring to Rome, then perhaps there are five fallen emperors. There's one emperor now, and then there's one more to come. There are some scholars who try to figure out then who are these five fallen kings, and they'll list five out. But the problem with it is that it ends up placing John in his writing at a time that is not in sync with what we actually think he was writing at. If we look at when John was actually writing, that means that seven or more emperors would have passed by then. And so it doesn't quite match up with the numbering that we have here. A second way of looking at this is to look at it from an Old Testament perspective. These seven kings or seven kingdoms, we could say, because the horns that we're about to look at, they don't have kingdoms. So these have kingdoms. So in the Old Testament perspective, we can find something a little more interesting. You have Egypt, You have Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece. 5. The fifth has fallen, and now there's one that stands, and that's the current one. In John's writing, that's Rome. And then that begs the question, well, what's the seventh kingdom to come? And we could be trying to figure that out all our lives. The issue with this and the previous interpretation is that it tries too hard to take the number 7 literally. Like, we've not taken the number 7 literally this whole time. We've always understood it in the context of full, or the perfected amount of whatever it is that we're talking about. So the full amount of God's wrath, or the full amount of God's warnings, right? So here, perhaps it's best for us to understand what we're reading. We're not reading a science book. This is not a recipe book. This is what we call as apocalyptic literature. If you go back and when we read the book of Daniel or Ezekiel or any one of the Old Testament books which has this style of writing, we know that we don't take numbers very straightforward and literally. Instead, then, what we can understand from this is that the beast represents the fullness of the evil kingdoms of this world. And John, as his writing, is writing from the 5th phase of whatever this evil chronology would be. And we're just left thinking about the fact that we're very close to the end, which is, in fact, the whole point of this book. Remember, the point of this book, the purpose of this book, is not to map out the exact timeline so that we can decide when we need to be serious about our devotion and about our lives as Christians. And it's not meant to be mapping out the time so that we can know when we should have our ticket in hand. Instead, this is meant to give us purpose in the here and in the now, no matter when in history we are living. Looking at the next part, there's 10 horns. And these 10 horns, and they're not kingdoms, they're very specific about that. This seems to be a reference to Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, we have a similar reference of 10 horns. And each one of these horns is like a new leader, a kind of AntiChrist that speaks up and speaks out against God. So much so that in Daniel's passage, there is one little horn that rises up and speaks very arrogantly. And this is what is, I think, being referenced to when Jesus is addressing Caiaphas. And this is why Caiaphas gets so angry when Jesus says, "Behold, you will see the Son of Man ascending and descending on the angels." Well, that was a reference to this passage and this idea. And so there are many antichrists that have come and are going to come. Now, I want to make this very clear. Go and read 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 to 28. 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 to 28. The author that we all know and love, John, is writing letters. At least we say that it's John. John is writing letters to a community. And there in John chapter 2, he talks about antichrists. And there are many that are present during his time. And he says that there are many more to come. Do not be deceived by all of these leaders who come and try to lead people astray from God, from confessing that Jesus is Lord. Anything, any teaching that gets us to give our allegiance to anyone other than Christ is a message that comes from the Antichrist. And this is what's being presented. Again, this is all to show, John, you shouldn't be so surprised when you see all these things, because this is kind of what you already wrote about. Well, we're not going to go that so far as to say that, but we can say that this is already known. It should be known by the community. Just please go and read that 1 John passage, and you'll see how it fits in so perfectly with this study of the book of Revelation. Having said that, Let's look further. And you realize that the point of saying all of this was to tell John, see, you shouldn't be so surprised. But then moreover, even though you now recognize that this thing has been happening and will be happening for some more time, please, John, remember that when the Lamb comes, he will conquer it all. And so that battle that we were expecting to learn more about or to read more about at that sixth bowl, well, it's really hardly anything at all. And we will talk about it. It's still yet to come. I mean, as far as the biblical literature, when we get further on in the book of Revelation, we will get to this battle, and we're going to talk about it there again. But just look in the Revelation chapter 17, verses 14. See, there you see, they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those with him are called and chosen to be faithful. Now, this is the idea that at the fullness of all of these evil kingdoms, God is going to wipe it out. There's no competition. There's no real threat to God. All of these things will come to an end. And the beautiful, and I hope we catch the emphasis here, it's the Lamb that conquers, that slain Lamb, the one that was killed. The killed slain Lamb is going to conquer all of these kingdoms. Now, what is so interesting is that the slain Lamb is given another title here, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. This is a title, a reference given to God himself, because God is the God of gods. Now, in this context, when we're talking about all of the leaders of the various evil kingdoms, and when we're talking about these other figures of power who are, leading people astray, we have to recognize that what we have here is actually the gospel message, by the way, right? So the gospel message is, and write this down so that you know this, right? This should be stuff that we were taught in Sunday school. The gospel message is Jesus is Lord. There's a lot of other things that we can say about the gospel, and I'm not saying that those things aren't included. But if you want the fullest, most comprehensive way to describe the gospel, it's simply Jesus is Lord. In fact, the word gospel in the Old Testament, when it's used as the Hebrew word basar, or in the New Testament, euangelion, both times it's a word that means a proclamation that a new king has been installed. And you know what? That is good news, especially if we live in a world where there is a woman riding a beast. When we live in a world where there are several kingdoms that have committed themselves to fight against God, when you have countless leaders that are leading the people astray, it is good news to know that they are not the king, that Christ is the king, that Jesus is the king. This is the gospel that we should be telling people, that we should be proclaiming to the world, and how his victory has been won through the cross. So when we get to verse 16 and 17, we get a slight nuance of how Jesus's victory, or at least in this case, how the Lamb or God overthrows the evil powers of this world. And it's a very cannibalistic punishment. Well, evil devours itself. Ezekiel, and if you want to write these references down, Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 39 to 40, and then turn to chapter 23, verses 25 to 27, and then for the cherry on the top is Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 18. Each one of these passages, it maps out the internal strife that occurs within the evil world that serves the very purpose of God, to bring about justice. God is so in control that not only does he conquer, but he gets it so that evil destroys itself. And we see, and we can come up with all sorts of examples for how we've seen how evil topples itself. Think about any corrupt government in the world and how it does overthrow itself within no time. And this is part of how God is conquering. The other part of how God is conquering is through the Lamb and the ministry of the Lamb, which we all should continue to be partakers in. Here we conclude with this idea that the woman that you saw is the great city that rules over all the kings of this world. Well, it's all going to get thrown down. It's all going to get flattened, and it's all going to, as we will see shortly, thrown into the lake of fire. It's going to be burned and consumed, just like the reference to eating itself. This helps us to understand how the battle from the sixth bowl looks from another perspective, And yet we still have more shades, more layers to add on to this. And so when we turn to the next chapter, we will read about the message and the declaration of the fall of Babylon. And yes, I know we've talked about this before, because the book of Revelation has already declared earlier on that Babylon the Great has fallen. But this is another layer. So we will investigate this. And then after that, we will, and that continues all the way up to the beginning parts of chapter 19. And then we're going to revisit that battle of the sixth bull in the second part of Revelation chapter 19 into 20. And there's some interesting stuff there that people seem to be very much fixated on that we will spend some time studying. And then finally, it all culminates with the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 21 and 22. So the end is near, the end of the book study, that is. And in addition to that, recognize that we have this time to use for God's glory, to push back the evil in this world. So we will pause there. If there are any questions, we can take them up.